From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today, two Wisconsin farmers share how they're being impacted by federal funding freezes. Then we'll hear from two people who rely on Medicaid and how cuts to that program could affect them.
Medicaid is everything to me because if I don't have it, I can't go to the doctor, I can't see the doctor, I won't be able to have transportation, I can't walk that good, I have arthritis.
Plus, a UW-Milwaukee professor shares her experience researching ocean volcanoes.
People have certainly done work in this general area before, but the places that we went to and that we were able to dive down in the submersible, like literally no person has ever laid their eyes on that spot on Earth before.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. But first, here are today's headlines. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. Much of the nation's food supply comes from farmers who get financial help from federal programs. The Trump administration has been reviewing those dollars and trying to cut staff at the U.S. Agriculture Department. Some funding freezes have ended, and a panel has ruled that 6,000 USDA workers can go back to work, for now. But for Wisconsin farmers Sarah George and Emmett Fisher, funding and staffing questions remain. George grows specialty crops like fruits and vegetables. Fisher is a dairy farmer who also provides food for people in a subscription program. They join WUWM's Chuck Kornbach to share their experiences. They begin with why they began farming.
I was going to grow fruits and vegetables for my own family and for myself, and started sharing the fruits and vegetables with my community members, and just loved the feeling of feeding the community. So I began selling at the Wabasha Farmers Market way back in 2010. And just loved connecting with the community, and they embraced the fact that they knew where their food was coming from. They loved that they could come and visit the farm. That connection to where the food was grown was amazing. And I couldn't stop. It's to eat that fresh, healthy, nutrient-dense fruit right off the vine, right out of the field, was amazing for me. And I was able to share that with the community, and it's just a great feeling.
Thank you. And Emmett Fisher, your love of farming comes from what?
Yeah, it's a lot of different things, but we like being outside. I really like, physical work. I also like the sort of mental challenge of the constant problem solving. I love doing something different almost every day. A lot of it too is about being our own bosses, and my wife and I really enjoy working together. And getting to do that and run a business together is a satisfying thing for us. But also sort of echoing what Sarah said, I mean, it is a really gratifying thing to have those personal connections with the people who are, going to eat the food that we're growing. And that's part of what makes it worth it and keeps us going when the challenges stack up.
Well, both of you have had plans to expand, improve your operations, and there was going to be some federal money. Emmett Fisher, you had plans for solar energy, is that right?
We went into 2025 really kind of excited and encouraged because we had, received a 5-year contract. That's a federal program administered on the state level that rewards farmers for conservation practices that we've already taken. So things we're already doing. So I signed a contract for that program in December. At the same time, I heard word that I may qualify for some new pasture fencing because of expanded criteria around who was eligible because of an increase in funding. And then in early January, we got notice that we had been awarded a federal grant that cost shares for solar panels on rural businesses. And then, with the administration change and all of the funding freezes, that sort of all just slowly went away. I mean, I signed the contract for the solar panel grant, and within days it was frozen. The conservation program, with the 5-year contract, that payment doesn't come out until November. So it's currently frozen. Obviously, there's time before November for it to get worked out, but that's a 5-year program. It works out to about $30,000 over 5 years. The solar grant was about $20,000 grant, and the fencing, I don't know, what the expense would have been, but due to the, in part due to the drastic reduction in funds available, we're no longer eligible for that either.
Had you shelled out money for either of those, or and waiting to be paid back, or?
No, and I'm really grateful to not be in that position because I know there are farmers out there who not only signed the contract but also spent all the money, and now they have panels on their roof, and the government said, "Yeah, we'll pay you back for those," and they're not getting paid back. They've built fences that they should have been paid back for, and they haven't been paid back for, and people are on the hook for in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars that they expected to be repaid, and in the meantime they're just paying interest on a loan that they didn't think they would have to carry. So I'm very grateful that we're not in that position, but at the same time, we're a small farm. It's more than pocket change for us, and the uncertainty is a challenge. Farming is a business where you deal with a lot of uncertainty, but it's going to be hard for us to figure out how to pick up that slack. I mean, the solar program is a big disappointment, but obviously we would have been paying sort of the same amount for the loan on that system as for our utilities. So it's not like an instant impact, but the conservation program, that's just, money that we expected to have in our pockets this year. And it's not like we can just find that somewhere else. So that's going to be harder to come up with.
And Sarah George, you also work for a nonprofit, Renewing the Countryside. Tell me how what's going on, what's being discussed in Washington might affect that nonprofit's efforts.
What we do, we have a couple different programs that are, I would say, pretty high at risk. One of them, a program called Go Farm Connect, where we have farmers connecting farmers to USDA resources. And our big focus for this particular project is helping those underserved farmers. So, beginning farmers, emerging farmers, veterans, and BIPOC farmers, and understand what it takes to farm, how to become a sustainable farm, building trust with them so that we can share these resources, and then introducing them to the USDA and sharing with them the programs that the USDA offers. And right now, one of the big things that we do with Go Farm Connect, not just connecting farmer to farmer, but we also host events at like USDA service centers to introduce these farmers to these buildings so they don't always know where their location is or where to park or which office to go into, because there's so many different offices in the service center, who to talk to once you get in there. And right now, the morale at the USDA service centers is pretty low, and they don't have the staff to keep up with the capacity of what's going on. They're struggling to do their day-to-day activities, and they all just kind of want to keep their jobs. But we can't host these events, and the farmer connections is really complicated. That one is a concern of mine that is under review right now. We also have a land access program where we have navigators out there helping farmers navigate where and how to purchase land, what they need to put together for paperwork, what record keeping they need to do so that they can get low interest loans from the Farm Service Agency. That one is at risk because it's a beginning farmer and rancher grant. And you know, nonprofits, we're out there doing that hands on work, introducing farmers to sustainable practices, helping them with their finances, creating marketing channels for them so that we can encourage them to continue farming and do what they're best at. And as a nonprofit, and working in a nonprofit area, managing some of these different grants, I wake up in the morning and I'm like, oh gosh, don't let me see the email that says this grant is done or this contract has to be terminated. And we're getting notifications pretty regularly. And my heart stops when I see notes from the USDA. So this is a very, very challenging time for nonprofits out there that are supporting our rural food system and helping these farmers so that they can succeed.
Generally, we've heard from the USDA sentences like, we have to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. President Trump and others in Washington talk about federal debt. What do you think when you hear their sort of general rationales for some of these cuts or freezes? And Emmett Fisher first, maybe?
I would love to see the federal budget be balanced. I'd love to see the deficit come down. I don't think that, taking on more and more federal debt to put off our problems until later and have our kids have to deal with all of these deficits is a good thing at all. The reality that I don't think everyone understands about farming is that for decades now we've pursued as a country a system of promoting overproduction and free trade to keep the price of groceries low. And as part of that, we've put in place a lot of price supports and other subsidies for farmers to keep farms in business. And even with all of those supports, you see massive consolidation in every agricultural sector right now. It's not an easy time in farming. So I guess it's hard to see why a small farm where you have a couple people working pretty hard, certainly as hard as we can, to feed our community, our friends and neighbors, that we're the place to start with that kind of belt tightening. Seems confusing, I guess. And my wife was saying, at the end of the day, really the people that are subsidized are our customers, because, she was just doing the math to say, like, well, we don't really like having to rely on government support, so how much would we have to raise our prices? Well, it turns out to be about 150%. So I think that would be hard for our customers to pay that kind of price for food. So it's a complicated issue. And I guess I'll just say, too, that it feels, when you have the current spending package that just passed the House, looking at giving, over $4 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthy, it feels a little bit like a reverse Robin Hood situation where somehow we're supposed to pick up the slack while the people at the top get a break.
And Sarah George, the government spends too much. Your reaction to that rationale?
I think Emmett nailed it on the head when it comes to, wanting to see the federal deficit decrease. We don't want to increase that in any way, shape, or form. But the USDA programs that are out there to support farmers and keep farmers farming. And in Wisconsin, as one example, is that we saw a drop of nearly 10% of the family farms from 2017 to 2022. We're losing farmers every day, and farming is hard. You've heard me say it before. It takes a hell of a lot of radishes to make a house payment. And when you're growing specialty crops, that's what we're doing, is making our house payments based on the radishes that we grow and the tomatoes that we produce and sell, and the cows that we're milking, as in Emmett's case. And by doing so, having that support be there, whether it's a low interest loan or a grant for soil health, those are really impactful on our farmers. And it keeps our farmers farming so that we have healthy, nutritious foods on our tables. And I will say that when it comes to the USDA programs like the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, one thing that is often overlooked on a pretty consistent basis is not only do they provide loans from the Farm Service Agency or grants from the NRCS, but they also are there to support us with technical assistance. They've seen things done on farms, and technical assistance is free. It's costing nothing. We need staff. Because when you're farming, you're out in the country, you're by yourself, you feel like you're on a deserted island, like you're the only one that's navigated this. And they can share with you what they've seen at other farms. They can give you addresses and connections to other farmers so you can go talk with those farmers and learn from them. And then they can refer you to organizations like Renewing the Countryside or Michael Fields Agricultural Institute or Marble Seed, who has resources out there. And without that, we're going to lose a lot of farmers in our community. And that just breaks my heart.
Sarah George is a specialty farmer from Pepin, Wisconsin. Emmett Fisher is a dairy farmer and vegetable grower in Hager City, Wisconsin. They both spoke with WUWM's Chuck Quirmbach. Medicaid provides free and low-cost health coverage to 72 million low-income Americans and those with disabilities. Last month, Republicans in Congress tasked the House committee that oversees Medicaid to cut billions from its budget. That process, called budget reconciliation, is ongoing. WUWM's Mayan Silver asked two Medicaid recipients to weigh in on all the ways they get support from the program.
Just 1 second here. We got a package here.
Felicia Claiborne just got a delivery.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so what we just got is a package from Walmart that has sugar-free cookies in it. So basically, that's through the Medicaid program, too. I can order sugar-free. I can order anything that is healthy through that.
The cookies are for Claiborne's vision loss support group. She's visually impaired. If you see her out and about, you'll see she uses a white identification cane and sometimes a support cane. At her apartment, she has other accommodations, like a walk-in shower.
Over here is a light because I have albinism and it's a condition called photophobia, which is a condition, is sensitivity to bright light. So in the mornings, I turn on this light, basically to be able to have low lighting in here.
Claiborne is also an advocate for people with developmental disabilities.
I am a person with autism and a person who has anxiety disorder and depression, but my depression is controlled. There are days when I feel like I just don't want to, sometimes get off the couch. It's like I don't want to move. It's like, can we just let the day go by or whatever? But sometimes it gives me a little off to get off that couch and say, you got things to do. You got people to see. You got things to go to.
You've got things to do is exactly right. Not one to just sit down and let life come at her. Claiborne would call herself a mover and a shaker.
I surely am a mover and a shaker.
That includes advocating against potential cuts to Medicaid.
Medicaid is everything to me because if I don't have it, I can't go to the doctor. I can't see the doctor. I won't be able to have transportation. I can't walk that good. I have arthritis in my foot and in my legs.
Through Medicaid, Claiborne gets health care, prescriptions, a CPAP machine to treat sleep apnea, and her Medicaid eligibility allows her to qualify for home-delivered meals.
So here in the refrigerator is my Meals on Wheels. I usually get them on Monday and Friday.
Medicaid coverage will be a big topic at this year's Disability Advocacy Day in Wisconsin. It's a virtual gathering on March 12th. Claiborne is optimistic. She recalls when the disability community's advocacy saved another big program in Wisconsin, IRIS. IRIS stands for Include, Respect, I Self-Direct. It's a long-term care program for adults with disabilities and the elderly. It gives people control over their own budget. They can pick their long-term care goals and choose which support services they'd like.
And finally, they saved it, and I remember those days when I used to help out with putting buses together, going to Madison to be able to do that.
And, I'm wondering how today compares to those days when you were advocating against cutting IRIS. Now these days you're advocating against cutting Medicaid in the federal government. How does it compare?
Basically, it's more because now a lot of people are on Medicaid. And it's not just people with disabilities, people who are in low income that's supporting their families. Some of them don't have the money to be able to pay a copay or a co-share or anything with their insurance or anything like that, or go to the doctor, or go to their day program, or go to the grocery store, or just be able to go to a gym, And so that's why you have to be able to help those in need. You know, we got to help those in our household, especially in our village, because this is our village. Everybody that's on Medicaid is in our village, because without it, how can we survive?
Congress has tasked the committee that oversees Medicaid to cut $880 billion from its budget. Republicans are looking to curb spending in order to extend President Trump's tax cuts and fund more immigration enforcement. Claiborne has a message to the politicians making this decision.
Please don't cut it. This is our life. This is our lifeline. Your lifeline is your phone, your kids, your family. Don't cut ours. We don't want to cut yours. Don't cut ours, because this is how we live. And we want to be able to live. We want to be able to have heat, food, clothing, and benefits too. If you can have it, we can have it too.
Another southeastern Wisconsin resident who could be affected by Medicaid cuts is Catherine Burrish.
So my name is Catherine Florence, and I would like to be assured that I'm just a regular adult than being someone with a disability, even though I do have a disability.
29-year-old Burrish has Down syndrome, but she says that doesn't define her. She has a job she enjoys at TJ Maxx. She loves TV shows like Full House and Friends, and she regularly hosts coffee clubs at her apartment.
Because I love being the barista when it comes to coffee club, because I like making coffees for everybody the way that I like.
A fluffy, white miniature Aussie Doodle puppy is bounding around Burrish's house right now. Wow, Catherine, this is your dog?
Yeah, this is my dog Piper.
Oh, nice. Wow.
She's actually Mom and Dad's dog, but she's visiting Catherine.
That's Julie, Catherine's mom, who's visiting today. Catherine lives on her own in an apartment in Elm Grove.
And I love living here. I've been living here for about the past 7 years. And I love being on my own, being away from my parents. Even though I do miss my dog Piper sometimes, but I know that she'll come and visit whenever my parents come and visit me, or I have them over for dinner.
Julie explains that the family uses IRIS, the program we mentioned earlier that helps people with disabilities determine how they live. It allows Catherine to live on her own with the help of support. Julie says that means Catherine's calling the shots. And Medicaid, which is now at risk of being cut, helps make Catherine's independence possible. It pays for her health insurance and long-term care services like transportation and meal planning support.
The biggest thing is if Medicaid went away. Like right now, Catherine's Medicaid barely covers what she uses, and actually the amount that they allocate for her care has gone down significantly this past year. Kind of an arbitrary new algorithm that they've started. And so her funding has gotten cut really drastically, and we're going to probably have to cut some of the few services she gets. But if it goes away, she won't be able to live independently. She's going to have to live home, and that is not what she wants. And her dad and I are getting older. I mean, we're, in our mid to late 60s, and, we've gotten to the point in our life that we've tried to build a sustainable life for her so that we can respect her wishes, but also look at the reality of the fact that we're not going to be around forever, and step away a little bit, knowing that she has the right supports in place, and that they're people we trust and that she trusts, and that she's able to make choices. We don't want her in a group home. We don't want her in a nursing home. She doesn't want to be there. She wants to be living independently, and she's able to do it with a little bit of support. And that's so critical. There are a lot of people on Medicaid that need major supports too. People who are in wheelchairs that they have to get help getting in and out of bed. I mean, they have to be dressed and fed and everything. People should be allowed to live with dignity and choice. And they should be able to choose the people who touch them and the people who are with them. And if Medicaid goes away or gets cut drastically, people just aren't going to be able to live. And the one thing, too, is providing services in the community in people's homes is about 10 times cheaper than putting people into like a DD center, like some kind of a institution. those institutions, they cost 10 times as much as what
What is a DD center?
That's like a developmental disability center. It's an institution, and there aren't enough nursing home beds for people. So the old centers, there was Southern Center is still open, but they only have like 160 people there. But those are the places that we don't want to go back to that. It's a poor way to live, and it's a very expensive way to live. People want to be in their communities, and having people like Catherine in our communities makes our communities and our world infinitely better, because they are just awesome members of our community. They contribute. Catherine works. She volunteers. She has been in a theater group. She goes to events. She's part of the community, and she makes it better every interaction she has with people.
Living independently is so important to Catherine.
Living here gives me, I've got more freedom to be me and be the person that I am, and just like living here and like having the freedom.
That was Catherine and Julie Burrish. You also heard from Felicia Clybourne. They're recipients of Medicaid, and spoke with WUWM's Mayan Silver about how potential cuts to the federal program could impact them. Did you know you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. Later in the show, we'll tell you about a locally produced podcast called Wish You Knew. We'll learn all about how it's helping young people with mental health. But first, we'll hear from a UW-Milwaukee professor who does her research at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. UW-Milwaukee is a research university and often makes contributions to multiple fields of study. Some of those contributions come from the field of water studies. And while you've probably heard of the School of Freshwater Sciences, which studies our Great Lakes, there's another body of water the university studies: the Pacific Ocean. More specifically, volcanoes that live on the ocean's floor. That is where UWM Associate Professor Julie Bowles does her work. She spoke with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez about what it looks like way down below the surface, where these ridges take form.
So if you think of the Earth as like an apple, so the skin of the apple would be the crust, and that's what we all walk around on the surface. And the crust is broken into a bunch of pieces like a jigsaw puzzle, and they move with respect to each other. The mid-ocean ridges are the places where you're making new crust. So you get deep material from deeper in the earth, from the mantle, that rises up to close to the surface. And when it rises up, some of it melts. And that's what makes these volcanoes, right? And you're basically forming new seafloor at these places. And so 70% of our surface is covered by the oceans, and so 70% of our surface is made at these volcanoes.
And it feels like it'd be really important to understand where these plate tectonics are pushing together or pulling apart.
Right. So this is where they're pulling apart. That's where the ocean plates are being born, and then basically where they're dying is the other end of the process. So the plates move away from these ridges, and then eventually the plate will encounter another plate, say a continental plate, and then the ocean plate is more dense, so it gets kind of forced underneath the continental plate and forced back deep down into the mantle. So it's kind of this recirculation process. So you're making new crust, it's moving away, and then it's eventually being recycled back down into the mantle. It basically looks like a mountain range, a linear mountain range that just extends for miles and miles and miles. So it's maybe a couple of miles tall, it has volcanoes at the top, and it just extends to the horizon and beyond.
And this is all on the seafloor?
And this is on the seafloor, yeah. You can't see very far in front of you because the light doesn't penetrate that deep in the ocean. So when you're right at the summit, It looks like gray volcanic rocks that maybe have some sediment piled up on top of them. Some of them look a little glassy. There's often fissures, kind of collapse pits. If you're really lucky, you might see a hydrothermal vent community. So the cold ocean water gets down into the crust, into the rocks, through the faults and the cracks, and then it heats up because of all the hot kind of volcanic activity below. And then that water exits the seafloor in really focused places like a geyser kind of. And you get these kind of amazing biological communities that thrive around these vents. So this last expedition was a collaboration with some colleagues at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which is in San Diego. It's part of University of California, San Diego, and some colleagues at Boise State University in Idaho. And
I love it that Idaho and Wisconsin are just in the middle of the Pacific Ocean
great.
studying volcanoes.
So we all met up in San Diego, and then we spent 11 days driving down to the South Pacific. Once we got there, what we were interested in looking at is kind of how often these eruptions happen and how big they are. Are they kind of clustered together in time? And if so, like how are they clustered together in time? So in order to do that, we had to actually get samples from the seafloor, and we had to be able to see the seafloor as well, to have an idea of what the seafloor actually looks like. We had a couple of different specialized scientific vehicles that we were working with. One is called an autonomous underwater vehicle, and this particular one is named Sentry. It collects a lot of data, so it collects information about the shape of the seafloor, kind of high-resolution picture of where there are small kind of volcanic mounds, where there's faults, where there's fissures. It helps us to decide where we might want to go to collect samples and to look more closely. Our target was basically the summit of this ridge. And then ideally, we would want to collect actual rock samples. And we would want to see with our eyes as well what's down there. So there's a small submersible, like a little mini submarine that fits 3 people.
This is a safer submersible than the submersible we may be familiar with.
Yes, it's designed in a totally different way. And actually, there's a titanium sphere that the people sit in. And that sphere was actually forged right here in Milwaukee, in Cudahy, which is pretty cool.
We have so many connections to the Pacific Ocean.
I know.
We should name it the Milwaukee Ocean.
We should. So I got to sit in the Milwaukee sphere and go to the bottom of the ocean. And the submersible has these robotic arms, so that lets you collect samples and manipulate equipment if you were doing that as well. So then we could go down and we could actually see what it looked like, and we could collect samples that we could take back home and work with.
You're in the middle of the ocean doing this study for not a short amount of time. What did you see when you were out there that made maybe the research more difficult?
Yeah, we definitely ran into more challenges than we were expecting. It's really only safe to launch both of these vehicles when the waves aren't too chaotic or too big and when the winds aren't too high. We definitely had a few days where there was a lot of movement on the ship. I think especially when the ship is underway, like when we're not just sitting there. I always get at least a little bit seasick, at least at the beginning of the trip. We finally ended up having what we thought was going to be a decent window of a few days towards the end of the cruise where we could get maybe 3 or 4 dives in a row. But then, unfortunately, there had been 2 or 3 sharks in the area, which is not unheard of. The ship is sitting there for a long time. The lights attract kind of squid and smaller fish, and then the sharks are probably attracted by those because they feed on them. And at first the sharks were just kind of curious and they weren't really a concern. But towards the end, there were kind of more sharks coming and they were starting to display more aggressive behavior. And so curious sharks aren't really a problem for the swimmers, but sharks that are coming at you is a little bit more of a concern. So there's a small little workboat that they launch for the swimmers. And they were putting kind of sticks in the water to fend off the sharks, and the sharks were like lunging at the sticks.
Okay.
So at that point, the decision was made that
let's not put people in the water.
No people in the water. No more dives. It's not worth risking anybody's life or health for this.
Absolutely.
By any means. So
I think about folks in Milwaukee because we have Lake Michigan very close, which is also great for UWM to go and study and have access to. And I feel like we generally have a appreciation for maybe like smaller bodies of water in the state. I think something that we don't think about, though, as much as how the oceans, these ginormous bodies of water, as you said, covering 70% of this earth, affect us in our everyday lives, affect things like climate. So what should we know more about the ocean and the way not only just the volcanic presence and this history affects us, but also these huge bodies of water?
Yeah, I mean, I guess thinking at a couple different time scales. So if we're talking about the volcanic process and this process of plate tectonics, this kind of overturning of Earth's mantle that I was talking about, that process over millions of years or hundreds of million years is part of the process that kind of cycles carbon kind of into and out of the atmosphere and between the deep Earth. And so over very long time scales, that's kind of helping to moderate our climate on Earth. If you want to talk about kind of shorter time scales, the water has a huge role on Earth's climate. So the water, whether it's in the ocean or whether it's in Lake Michigan, water can absorb a ton of heat without changing temperature very much. So compared to the land, the water can absorb a lot more heat. So it's this big heat pump in a way, the ocean is. So it absorbs a lot of heat at the equator, and then the ocean currents redistribute that heat around the Earth. If we didn't have the ocean currents, the temperature would probably be kind of hotter at the equator, and it would be a lot colder at the poles. So it also has kind of a big moderating influence on our climate, in addition to being a big carbon sink as well and affecting climate that way.
So you had this expedition, hit the summit, faced all these obstacles and challenges along the way, had what looks like, via the pictures, an incredible ping pong tournament as well. I know you're doing this part of it, which is very analytical, and the research part of it, but are you ever like awe-inspired by the time that's passed or what you're seeing? How do those kind of things hit you?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I mean, people have certainly done work in this general area before. But the specific places that we went to and that we were able to dive down in the submersible, like literally no person has ever laid their eyes on that spot on Earth before. And it's just kind of crazy to see this thing that is this eerie, otherworldly place that no one's seen before. And very few people get the privilege of seeing.
Julie Bowles is an associate professor at UWM. She studies volcanoes in the Pacific Ocean. She spoke about her work with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez. We've got a new season of Bubbler Talk going, and we need some new questions. Submit your questions about the Milwaukee area at WUWM.com. Coming up, we'll learn about a Milwaukee area podcast, giving teens a platform to talk about their mental health journey.
You may not feel like you have a great support system, but we hope that this podcast can be a form of support in your life and recognize that you are not alone.
That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. To help break the stigma, a Milwaukee area podcast is giving teens a platform to talk about their mental health. Every other week, the teenage hosts of the Wish You Knew podcast sit down with teen guests to reflect on their mental health journeys. Lake Effect's Excret Nunez spoke with Levi Stein, the executive director of the Friendship Circle of Wisconsin, the organization that produces the podcast. She also spoke with Lizzie Thorough, a co-host of the podcast. Stein begins by explaining how the podcast got started.
Friendship Circle is a local nonprofit organization that works to provide opportunities of friendship for people with disabilities and those struggling with mental health. There are so many vulnerable populations that are so isolated, and we want to give them that opportunity to be included, to be productive members of society. No one should struggle alone. And we do that through a variety of different programming. So on the disability side, we have social recreational program for both children and adults with disabilities, like Friends at Home, where teen volunteers visit the homes of kids with disabilities, to, again, like bowling or adaptive softball or taekwondo, all kinds of fun and exciting stuff. We also have a coffee shop, a bakery, and an art studio in Fox Point that houses our employment training program for adults with disabilities, and that is open to the public that anyone can come in and enjoy. On the mental health side, which is our You Matter division of Friendship Circle, we do a lot of suicide prevention trainings. We do teen mental health support groups. We do other mental health related events and programming. And of course, the Wish You Knew podcast.
So I definitely see how this project dovetails with the mission of the Friendship Circle and You Matter. So the Wish You Knew podcast introduces listeners to teen guests who have struggled and overcome significant mental health challenges. How did the idea to create this podcast come about?
So I served on the committee of Office of Children's Mental Health, which is a statewide committee, and we did a lot of research on what is the need for our society's youth in the field of mental health. And one of the outcomes of all that research and study was peer support. That was one big piece. And another piece was youth voice, not having an opportunity for our kids to really share how they feel. And at the same time, I know just with working with kids with disabilities, and even as a kid myself, I was a kid at one point, we're always being told by other adults what to do. And we're not necessarily looking for that always. Sometimes we just need a peer to just support, one another. And also when it comes to mental health, having a genuine conversation with another peer is so different than when you're talking to an adult who's kind of trying to fix you or make you better or whatever.
Right.
When it's two kids talking, it's just a more genuine conversation. And that's how the podcast idea came up, where all the other mental health podcasts out there are really adults or experts that are talking to others. Here, it's not about the expert background. It's about two kids having a conversation and giving the world an opportunity to hear what's going through our youth today, what's happening to them. And then, of course, for so many of the teens that are listening, to not feel alone.
Right. I'm also wondering, Lizzie,
Hello.
you and Autumn are both the season 2 hosts of Wish You Knew. Autumn, unfortunately, couldn't be here today. But yeah, I'm curious, how does the editing work for this, for the podcast?
Sure. Yeah. So Autumn and I came in to this podcast not really knowing a whole lot about editing. YouTube really solved a lot of our inquiries, which is great. So we record the episodes. It takes about 40-minute long conversations, and we really try and keep it conversational based, not an interview where I'm asking question after question. We want it to feel authentic because it is a vulnerable situation. So we go back and forth, and after this back and forth, we take our recordings home and we sit down and we listen to every single one of them. We really just listen through to make sure it sounds like an authentic conversation. Oftentimes this takes like 4 hours, and it's really only a 30-minute segment. We put a lot of work into the editing, and we had to learn a lot throughout it. And then after the fact, like Levi noted, we send over our rough draft, if you will, to Levi. He sends that to the You Matter committee, and they let us know if they have any suggestions. Sometimes they'll have us edit out certain language. That's something I learned a lot about in the first episode, where we were talking about our own stories, Autumn and I, and something that part of language that I used often was crazy. I'd talk about my story and I'd say, I thought it was crazy X, Y, and Z, and I never thought once that was a poor word choice because it was about me. But when I recognized that this was going to be shared with a lot of people who might be able to find themselves in a similar situation, they shouldn't have a word with that connotation, if you will, relating to something so vulnerable about them. So that's something we learned a lot about. I think that we learned a lot about the way in which to address conversations and steer them, as well as just things to keep off the table, like medications, stuff like that you would never think of before.
So I'm curious as to how this opportunity came up, and why did you, Lizzie, decide to become a host of this podcast?
Sure. So I am a senior student at the University School of Milwaukee, and something kind of interesting that our school brings up is the opportunity for a transcript designation. And what I chose to do with this, there's a whole bunch of different options. I chose to look down the path of service. So I spent the first 3 years of my high school career doing hours and hours of service. I worked a lot with the healthcare realm in service, and so I did some research on that. And then your senior year, you need to do an internship or a tower project. I ended up doing both. Long story short, through this, one of my friends from the class works with Levi. Her name's Hannah, and she told me that Levi was looking for someone to be a podcast host. And I never, ever thought about joining a podcast before this, but she said, I know you have a story, and I think it could be a really great opportunity for you. So I worked up the courage. I went over, I met Levi, and I had an interview with him. And we talked for, I want to say, 15 minutes. And after that, he had me submit a recording where I would mock interview someone in my life. So I did that with my mom. And after a couple of days, Levi called me and let me know that I and another person were able to become hosts. And I was very surprised by this. I did not think I had anything in me to be able to become a host, but it was very exciting. And in the small world that we live in, the two people that Levi ended up contacting with were me and then my friend Autumn, who also goes to USM and who has been one of my great friends for plenty of years. So we decided we were going to do it. And I think all along, I was super excited about the idea, but I didn't realize that I was going to have to go share my mental health journey. And that was a lot for me. Of course, I knew what I was about to do, but I didn't take it into heart. So going in and sharing my story and being vulnerable was something really difficult for me because the stigma, I think, is so hard out there and it's so overpowering. So just working up the courage to be able to share my story for the better good of me and everyone else out there listening who might be able to relate was something that I really had to overcome. And I feel like I've come a long way in the mental health realm, being able to go out and become an advocate throughout this podcast.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. And yeah, I was going to ask you, in the first episode of this season, you and Autumn both share your journey navigating mental health challenges and how you overcame them. But I guess what made you want to share your story? I know you listed a couple of things.
Sure. So I have had my fair journey with mental health from a young age. I had a lot to do with anxiety and some seasonal depression in my past. And a lot of time, despite having a great support system at home, my family was very supportive. They found me therapists. They got me all the resources that I could ever want. I didn't want to talk about it because I was scared that it made me less than, that this was something that was all in my head and I couldn't control it. And I had that mindset for a long time in my life, that this was something I kept quiet. This was my issue, no one else's. And I think the opportunity that this podcast presented was to overcome the stigma in the mental health community. There's so much stigma about this is your burden. No one else has to worry about it. And that's not true. Mental health is just as important as physical health. And I think that this podcast, making me overcome those thoughts, has really taught me a lot about it. And I'm just so proud to be able to sit here now and say that I am stronger than the stigma. And being a part of this podcast, I'm no expert, but just having these conversations can help a lot of other students in a similar situation overcome the stigma for themselves as well.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention like some of the conversations. The conversations on the podcast range from one guest talking about their struggles with body image and anorexia, another guest experiencing depression while recovering from a sports injury, and someone else, navigating feelings of isolation after immigrating to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it's important to give young people this platform to be vulnerable and share these difficult experiences?
Sure. So, like I said earlier, there's no one story for mental health. There's so many different things. And the stigma, a lot of times, too, will have you have to define your journey. And I think that something interesting about this podcast is there's no right or wrong way to have a mental health journey. So Levi has been very adamant about having a whole plethora of stories ranging from all the things that you were talking about earlier. And I think that this podcast is important and ultimately show all of our audience. You may not feel like you have a great support system, but we hope that this podcast can be a form of support in your life and recognize that you are not alone and that it's a journey for a reason. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, but this is just one step to finding that light. So I think that coming on this podcast, showing that vulnerability helps people in the long run, being able to overcome that stigma in the mental health realm and ultimately anywhere else in their life. So it's really a great life skill that Levi is implementing into the youth generation.
Before we wrap up, I want to take it back to the beginning. Levi, do you feel like the Friendship Circle of Wisconsin is accomplishing what it originally set out to do with the Wish You Knew podcast?
It's definitely making progress towards it. I mean, we definitely need to get the word out. There are so many kids right now that are still struggling alone. There are so many people in our community still having thoughts of suicide, so many people that are going through something that no one should have to go through, but many are, and they don't need to go through it alone. And until everyone is feeling connected, we're not going to stop.
Levi Stein is the executive director of the Friendship Circle of Wisconsin, the organization that produces the Wish You Knew podcast. Lizzie Thorough is a senior at University School of Milwaukee and co-host of the Wish You Knew podcast. They both spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez. And that is Lake Effect for today. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.